Welcome to this third class in Brexit, a crash course. Today we're going to deal with the future, and I should say, for those who watch this online, today is the US presidential election, and Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, and therefore some of what I'll say, perhaps towards the end, refers to today's events, although this is in the afternoon, so we don't know what the result actually is yet. So just to recap, first class, back on the 27th of October, we looked at the history of the UK and the EU in terms of its relationships, in terms of their relations, and then we looked at the referendum campaign, the actual vote and the outcome, and what actually happened on the day. And today we're going to look at the future. But very quickly, let's just recap what we've covered in the past 2 weeks, just briefly to provide us with some context about what we'll talk about today. Why study Brexit? Well, as I said last week, you don't see a country very often vote democratically to make a choice that could potentially recreate it in terms of its unity, change its identities, its political economy, its place in the world, and have potentially major ramifications for its allies in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere around the world. So studying Brexit is a case study of a country that's doing something quite unique, potentially. It's still too early to see what the full ramifications of this actually are. Nevertheless, you can study Brexit certainly to understand crises within government. That's already become pretty clear. Then why did Britain fail to connect to the EU's founding ideas, or how did it connect? Well, it certainly appreciated the security side of European integration, but was never going to commit fully to this given the experiences of the Second World War. Britain's experiences of European integration has been a very transactional one. It's not been one in terms of embracing the European Union to help redefine its identity, which helps in part explain the awkward partner role of Britain within the European Union's context development, but also, let's not forget, the quiet European. And this is something important that we'll come back to later on when we talk about the future of UK-EU relations. While yes, some parts of the European Union and some in the EU will be glad to see the back of an awkward partner, there is also a sense of trepidation because the rest of the European Union is losing what in some respects is quite a valuable partner. So we'll come back to that later. Why has it been so divisive in British politics? Well, again, the history tells you a lot about it in terms of the debate in the UK, which has always been very transactional, so it's never been one from the heart, it's just been kind of about the head. And why did David Cameron therefore call a vote on this issue if, as he had been told, and if he probably knew, this was potentially something that could go against it? And as somebody pointed out at a conference on referendums last week, it was strange that in this context, you were essentially asking the British people to vote for the status quo or something new, completely different. And you don't usually pitch in a referendum an option of the status quo versus change, because people usually go for kind of sometimes the change, especially when the status quo isn't very satisfying or doesn't usually get lots of support. So why did he call the vote? He called it mainly for reasons within the Conservative Party, but also, it must be said, because of tensions between the UK and the EU in terms of how the two have developed. Something he tried to grapple with when it came to the renegotiation, but which he failed, partly because the timing was off. If he'd waited a few years, maybe he would have secured a better renegotiation with the EU than he did. And then finally, why did Leave win? Well, they won because they were able to offer a better range of messages that played to a larger number of groups in British society, whether it was about immigration, sovereignty, identity, and so forth, or even to play to those who were uneasy about the economic outlook, who didn't think that things could get any worse for them. So they were able to appeal to the left-behind voters, and also as a way of kicking the government of the day. But you can find a whole host of reasons, and no one single reason. You can say immigration and sovereignty were certainly two of the defining things, but you can also say lots of things. So, what will we cover today? We left off last week with Theresa May appointing Boris Johnson as a Foreign Secretary, David Davis and Liam Fox, leading Brexiteers, to high positions within the British government. So where do we go now? Well, one of the things Theresa May said was that Brexit means Brexit, and we'll come back to that in a minute, about exactly what does she mean. Then I will go through the different negotiations that are now unfolding. There are about 13 different negotiations, debates going on within the UK, between the UK and the EU, and then finally within the EU itself. And I group into those as well a fourth but which I've merged into the other three, which is international level negotiations between the UK and the EU and international partners. But I've included those in the three, so it's not a separate one. I will talk a little bit about the global and potentially security implications of this, partly because that's one of my main areas of research. And then, putting slightly the cart before the horse, how do you study Brexit? At the end, we'll look at the different models and the different theories and the different ideas that are slowly emerging about how you can actually grapple with the complexity of Brexit in terms of trying to break it down. What theoretical models can you use to try and open up Brexit, to try and appreciate what is it that's been driving Brexit, what is it that will define how Brexit is going to happen. And then I'll say a few concluding remarks about where this leaves the UK. So, Theresa May said when she became Prime Minister after a leadership race that she didn't really have to do that much about to win. All the other candidates kind of knifed each other or kind of killed themselves by saying stupid things. She said that Brexit means Brexit. Now, as a holding remark, back in July, that was fine. It made sense. She needed to buy time, and she was just committing herself to saying that I'm going to deliver on Brexit in some way. But what does that actually mean? First thing to say is that Brexit has already unleashed a large number of very silly but sometimes quite useful terms. And I've decided to list them, partly because I'm trying to do this on a website. You can have a hard Brexit. You can have a soft Brexit. You can have a harsh Brexit, a long Brexit, a bloody Brexit, a dirty Brexit. You could talk about 50 shades of Brexit, an elastic Brexit, unprotected Brexit, or Brexpulsion. You could talk about a dog's Brexit. You could believe in Remain, or you could perhaps have Regrexit. You could basically want Britain to buck off. You could talk about Bramageddon in terms of what the outcome of Brexit could be. You could be a Brexiteer or a Bramona. You could chant Brexit juice, Brexit juice, Brexit juice in the hope of hoping the Brexit will appear. You could talk about Brexit wounds. You could Brexit through the gift shop. Or, as yet, we've not seen one, you could, if allegations of corruption come into this, see the emergence of Brexit Gate at some point in the future. Some people have already used that, but it will almost certainly come up if there's allegations of corruption. Or, as has already become apparent, some connections are also bringing it up with James Bond. So you could Brexit with love, or from Brexit with love. You only Brexit twice, Brexit is forever, Brexit and let Brexit, a view to a Brexit, license to Brexit, Brexit never dies, Brexit is not enough, Brexit another day, quantum of Brexit, and a spectre of Brexit. So, what does Brexit actually mean? Given you've heard all these different phrases, you can dig them all up, and there are more. There are really kind of offensive ones even out there. So what does Brexit actually mean? Well, the first biggest challenge we have is that we're not too sure what Theresa May herself actually felt or actually thought about Brexit. During the campaign, she remained on the Remain side, she campaigned for the Remain side, although she only ever gave one campaign speech. So she kind of kept her powder dry. She tried to kind of hedge her bets somewhat in terms of the actual outcome. Some considered her to be a Eurosceptic at heart. Others said, no, she's actually just a very pragmatic woman. But nevertheless, when it came to actually defining what Brexit means in terms of what she believes in, before the referendum, it wasn't too clear what she actually felt, because her own opinions were always kind of kept very kind of secret. So where does this take her now? When you were children, did you ever read a kind of a choose-your-own-adventure book? Where you got to the bottom of the page and it said, if you want to go left, turn to page 78. If you want to go right, turn to page 95 or something like that. Well, you could try and map out a kind of a choose-your-own-Brexit adventure and play the part of Theresa May. And a friend and I tried to start doing this a few months ago. And the first question was, do you believe in Brexit? As Theresa May. If you believe yes, then the story unfolds in one way. If you think no, then the story unfolds in another way. And as The Economist pointed out a few weeks ago, the road to Brexit is not exactly clear. There are lots of choices, there are going to be lots of kind of potential dangers, different ways in which you can go from a referendum to vote to leave the European Union to the point at which you define Brexit in some way. And the choices Theresa May faces are actually quite limited, in my opinion. You could think of her as some captain of a ship of state that is sailing into a storm, and all she's pretty much realised all she can kind of do is pretty much strap herself to the mast of the ship and hope the ship rides out the storm, because she's kind of realised, and this will become clear when we talk about the negotiations in a minute, there's a big storm ahead, whether it's an economic storm, a political storm, a constitutional storm, a social storm, whatever. There's a storm ahead, and she doesn't really have many ways around it. She can't skirt in and out, she can't really avoid it, so her only hope is basically to kind of go straight ahead and go through it, which is why now we've started to hear some talk of her saying, look, I'm prepared to stomach the idea of a hard Brexit, which is no special deal with the European Union. The UK leaves the single market and falls back on WTO defined relations with the rest of the European Union. So there's nothing special. She's prepared, apparently, to accept this. And to some extent, it's because of the strategic options that face her. She has no way around this, as will become clear as we go through the negotiations. She risks that the ship, well, the ship of state is not going to sink. When she comes through on the other side of the storm, she may have lost a few men overboard in the form of, say, Boris Johnson and Liam Fox and David Davis and so forth, who could be set up as the fall guys. The ship may be battered, it may have lost a deck in the form of Scotland, but it will still be sailing on, nevertheless, with her possibly as the captain of the ship of state. But why then might she have to go down this route? Well, if you open up the Brexit negotiations, you see there are 13 of them, divided into 3 groups. And the most important ones will really take place, first of all, within the UK. The kind of the transition, the kind of the middle bit will be between the UK and the EU, but don't overlook the third set of negotiations, which are within the remaining European Union itself, in terms of how it responds to Brexit. This is often overlooked within the UK political debate. So let's start with the United Kingdom itself and the debates and the negotiations that are slowly unfolding within the UK. First of all, and this connects to what we talked about last week, you've got what I call the Brexit narrative. What exactly did the British people vote for? Because if you can define a narrative that says the British people voted to leave the European Union because of immigration, then you're going to draw a red line on immigration when it comes to a new deal with the European Union. If, on the other hand, the Brexit narrative becomes one of, yes, they voted to leave the European Union, but they don't want to leave the single market, then other options become possible, such as remaining within the European Economic Area, or doing some closer deal with the rest of the European Union. So how that Brexit narrative now unfolds is going to be one of the most important things. And there, the key actors, as you can see on there, will be the political parties, the media, academia, and so forth, and the debate that's been going on now for quite some time about what it exactly was that the British people wanted Brexit to mean, because the referendum itself asked remain or leave. Well, okay, you chose leave. Now define leave. So what exactly is leave going to mean? You've got the tensions within party politics. At the end of last week's lecture, I talked about how the referendum outcome immediately led to change within the leadership of the Conservative Party. It led to change, or at least an attempt to change, I should say, within the leadership of the Labour Party. UKIP is in a certain state of crisis. The SNP has some problems and possible opportunities and dangers through this. The Green Party and the Liberal Democrats sense an opportunity in terms of how they'll position themselves. So the Lib Dems have said they would campaign to, say, reverse the decision of a referendum, or at least kind of put it to a second vote. So the parties themselves are beginning to manoeuvre and try and cope with this issue that has so often divided them. Divided the Labour Party, has to some extent divided the Conservative Party, although they've managed to maintain their unity. Then third, negotiations will actually happen within Parliament, and between Parliament and the people. And here, of course, we come on to the issue of the law lords, or the lords, in terms of, sorry, not the law lords, the Supreme Court and the role of the courts. You'll have seen last week that the High Court, not the Supreme Court, the High Court in the UK, ruled that essentially the government does not have the power to trigger Article 50, which is, of course, the article that's triggered within the European Union's treaties to begin the process of withdrawal of a member state. The High Court ruled that the United Kingdom's government does not have the right to do that without consulting Parliament. The British government basically argued that actually this is a royal prerogative, that the membership of the European Union is a foreign policy matter, and therefore as a royal prerogative, the British government can essentially trigger Article 50 without consulting Parliament. Royal prerogatives are powers held by the Crown, exercised by the British government in certain areas like foreign policy, commissioning of officers and so forth, which basically allow the government to do certain things without having to consult Parliament. Large areas of foreign policy can be done this way, although usually, eventually, you do have to consult Parliament on them. So until recently, the idea of declaring war, it was a royal prerogative. You didn't need to consult Parliament. Now there's a convention that you will go to consult Parliament after a certain amount of time. Of course, that doesn't stop the government using royal prerogatives to take action in an emergency. But the British government said, Article 50, we can do this without talking to Parliament. We don't need Parliament to vote for this. We can basically trigger Article 50 ourselves. The High Court, in an overwhelming decision, threw this opinion out and basically said, no, you must consult Parliament. Parliament must decide or must vote to trigger Brexit. That doesn't mean, as you can see from the headlines here, enemies of the people, we must get out of the EU. 3 judges yesterday blocked Brexit. They didn't block Brexit. They potentially delayed it, and they decided who should try and trigger Brexit. Now your country really does need you. The judges versus the people. It really raised an issue which, again, looking beyond the issue of Britain's membership of the European Union, is one that's been bubbling away in British politics for some time, which is the role of the judiciary versus the executive and parliament and so forth within the UK, which of course doesn't have a codified constitution. So it's never clear, is the referendum supposed to be binding? Is it not supposed to be binding? Is it advisory? And in this case, the referendum was deemed to be strictly advisory only, so Parliament must vote at some point. The government has contested this and has appealed to the Supreme Court. It was announced today that they will decide or make a judgment in early December on this matter, whether or not the Supreme Court backs the government or the plaintiffs who basically argued that the British government doesn't have the right to do this without consulting Parliament. It's already made clear that this is not going to be an easy and short process. Basically what it's going to mean is that if the British government can't trigger Article 50, then Theresa May's commitment to triggering Article 50 next March, April could probably be delayed by some time while she gets something through the House of Commons. But it's not just the House of Commons. Because UK Parliament and the people, remember, MPs, Lords. Oh, the Lords, the House of Lords. MPs, as I touched on last week, are largely, in terms of the numbers, if you remember me putting up that map of each constituent in terms of whether its MP wanted Britain to remain or leave, most MPs believe in Britain remaining in the European Union. Whether that's the case now is debatable. Ed Miliband, the former Labour leader, was here last week at a conference, and he was very clear that when it comes to voting for Article 50, of course he will vote to trigger Article 50, even though he was passionately committed to Britain remaining. That's a reflection of the fact that 75% of the people in his constituency voted leave. He can't ignore that. But nevertheless, this does delay the process by which that Article 50 will be triggered. Also because of their lordships. The House of Lords will have to vote on this, and the government does not have a majority in the House of Lords. So getting it through the Lords may take time. And even if the British government wins the appeal to the Supreme Court in a few weeks' time and is able to trigger Article 50 on their own, that doesn't stop at some point in the distant future Parliament having to vote into law what Brexit means. It just means that essentially at some point in the distant future, maybe 2 years away now, the British government will come forward with a proposal about Brexit that it's negotiated with the rest of the European Union, and Parliament will have to vote on that. So at some point Parliament will vote on Brexit. Into this, we also need to throw the issue of the UK as a united kingdom. What role the Scottish Government and Parliament, the Northern Ireland Government and Assembly, the Mayor of London, the Welsh Assembly will have in all of this. The Scottish Government has already made clear that it will also get involved now in this legal appeal to the Supreme Court. The role of the regions in this is quite contested. It varies between regions. So, for example, Wales, Northern Ireland and London don't have much of a constitutional say in Brexit, but the Scottish Parliament certainly will because of the Sewell Convention, which is basically that Westminster can't deal with stuff that's been devolved to Scotland. But if you're taking back powers from the European Union, such as fisheries and agricultural issues, for example, that is a devolved matter. So here, the Scottish Parliament will have to have a say. So London can't ignore what the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government want in all this. As I touched on last week, the Scottish nationalists see an opportunity in Brexit to push for independence or a second independence referendum. At the same time, there are real significant dangers in this for them. They know there are possible traps that take, for example, the issues of agriculture and fisheries. Scotland has long had some problems with the common fisheries policies of the European Union, so the idea of getting back control of Scotland's fisheries, for example, could be quite appealing to some in Scotland. So it's not too clear how the different regions will play out in this. In Northern Ireland, the European Union has played a very powerful background feature to the Northern Ireland peace process. One, in terms of funding, but also in terms of allowing the Irish and the UK governments to look at each other as equals, instead of Ireland being hidden behind Britain. It's facilitated to some extent the peace process there, in terms of having an open border. So what happens if we have to have a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic? This is something the Irish government is particularly worried about, and so are those in Northern Ireland. And then, as I touched on last week as well, the issue of London. London voted to remain, and London is a very distinct place within the United Kingdom. And London is certainly fighting to have its voice heard in terms of what Brexit could mean for the city and for its own interests within the United Kingdom. Somebody pointed out to me 2 weeks ago that, as far as they were concerned, the debate about Brexit is settled now elsewhere in England, and it's only in London that there's any debate about Britain remaining and so forth. Well, my answer to that is that, well, that's partly because the rest of England is largely a political wasteland compared to London. There's no devolved government, local government is emaciated, so there's no political networks, there's no big newspapers. Most of the political media debate and so forth is in London, and therefore there is a real possibility that London may define Brexit, much to the frustration of elsewhere in the United Kingdom. And then finally, for the United Kingdom, it faces choices about how it manages its relations with others elsewhere in the world in terms of what Brexit means for the relationship with the United States, which I'll come back to later on, emerging powers. So Theresa May this week is in India on a mission to try and drum up business. There, we'll come on to the issue of trade agreements. Will the UK, in leaving the European Union, have to negotiate all of the trade agreements that the EU has negotiated with other countries, or will it be able to kind of follow through on them and keep them? Opinion is still kind of divided on what Britain's future trade relations may look like, but Britain is certainly going to be in a position where it's going to try and negotiate trade deals, but at the same time, the number one priority is really going to be negotiating the relationship with the EU to begin with. That will also involve membership of the World Trade Organization. But of course, it's not just the UK. In this, you have the negotiations between the UK and the rest of the EU. First of all, you've got the negotiations to trigger Article 50 to begin Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. Article 50 itself, in the actual exit agreement, is actually going to be reasonably straightforward. I don't say that in a cavalier way. I appreciate that it's going to still be a hard negotiation, but actual exiting the European Union in terms of negotiating pensions, in terms of Britain's contributions to EU funding, what happens to EU citizens living in the EU, in the UK, and UK citizens living elsewhere in the EU, that will certainly be an issue. What's going to happen to, say, my European Union citizenship? Because I'm an EU citizen as a British citizen, do I automatically lose that? There are people who are arguing now that you should be able to keep your European Union citizenship if you wish. That may come up. The European Union and the UK have 2 years to negotiate this. Should be reasonably straightforward, but that's just the exit. Just the exit. It's just the UK leaving the European Union. What happens after that in terms of a new relationship, which is number 7 there, that's an entirely different matter. Some argue that the wording of Article 50 is very clear, that it states that the European Union and the departing member states should negotiate an exit deal with view, I can't remember the exact wording, but it's about something along the lines of with a view to also a new relationship. So it doesn't say you must also at the same time negotiate a new relationship in terms of a trading relationship, membership of the European Economic Area, or no relationship at all. Some say actually no, the two have to go hand in hand. But some elsewhere in the European Union say no, you exit and then we negotiate a new relationship. We're not negotiating them side by side. We'll come back to whether or not there may have to be a transition here in a moment, but nevertheless, negotiating that new relationship, lots of different options have been put forward over the years, such as membership of the European Economic Area, which includes countries like Norway and Switzerland and so forth. That would continue membership of the single market, possibly upgrading after the European Free Trade Agreement, which is a bit out of date now, but you could upgrade it. You could negotiate a new trade deal in terms of a very special relationship between the UK and the EU in terms of a trade agreement. Or you could have nothing at all. Britain could go for a hard Brexit, as it's called, which is having no formal actual agreement with the European Union in terms of what a new relationship will be like. The key actors there won't just be the UK. The UK will have to negotiate with the rest of the European Union in terms of 27 member states, the Parliament and so forth. And one thing that's important here is how the rest of the EU agrees to this. The actual exit agreement will be negotiated under qualified majority voting. So the European Union has the system by which the member states vote in a certain way. They each have an allocation of votes based on their population, and they also at the same time there has to be a certain percentage of the population or the economy of the European Union that votes for something to go through. It's all an incredibly complex system, but essentially it has to be about 55% of all votes from the EU member states, and that has to represent, if I remember correctly, about 65% of the EU's population to approve the actual exit deal. That's the exit deal, not the new agreement. That's reasonably simple. Although, again, also you need to go to the European Parliament. The Parliament will have to vote on this 50% plus one, or whatever procedure the Parliament has, which means at some point Theresa May is going to have to give a speech to the European Parliament to sell the idea of a British exit or some new agreement. She's going to need to lobby the European Parliament, an institution that is not exactly much loved within the United Kingdom. Into this could also step the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice threw out, back in the early 90s, the original European Economic Area Agreement because it gave the non-EU member states too big a say within the European Union's decision-making bodies. They were supposed to have some form of say, so it threw it out, and we've got the current setup which has a kind of a shadow system of decision-making bodies. But nevertheless, the European Court of Justice therefore could get involved at some point and rule on whether the new deal, if it's some form of new relationship, is actually acceptable under the EU's treaties. But if we just go back, how do you therefore get from an exit agreement and a new agreement in terms of new relationship? How do you get the two? Because 2 years is not enough time. You've got 2 years in which to negotiate a British exit and possible new relationship, and most agree 2 years is not going to be a sufficient length of time. One reason the British government has not triggered Article 50 yet, and it's probably, well, Theresa May is aiming to trigger it sometime next spring, the spring of 2017, is one, because they're still trying to work out the ideas about what they actually want from the European Union, but it's also because Britain doesn't yet have the people to send to the meetings. We haven't recruited, the UK government hasn't recruited all the people it's going to need to negotiate Brexit. So, it gives you an idea, are we going to be able to negotiate this in 2 years? Is the EU or the UK going to have the sufficient time and resources to do this? No. So, as you see in number 6, Article 50 and Brexit transition. Some talk about a possible transition agreement, whereby the EU and the UK both agree, and it will take both sides to agree, that there will be a 5-year negotiating period in which Brexit happens. You could exit after 2 years and then remain a member of the European Economic Area for 5 years while they try to work out what a new relationship will actually look like. Eurosceptics worry that this will essentially sink Brexit, that Brexit will become some form of half Brexit or kind of soft Brexit or kind of very shallow Brexit. This is something Nigel Farage is certainly worried about when he spoke out against the court's rulings, because he saw this not as an attempt to stop Brexit, but to try and water it down, essentially. And that's what a transition deal could do. But without the transition deal, how do you get from actual kind of 2 year to kind of a 5-year period in terms of moving from an exit to a new agreement? Given that most people generally agree that some form of WTO membership at the end of 2 years is probably going to come as a bit of an economic shock. Next, number 8, EU in brackets UK. I've put this here because there is a danger in the Brexit debate that everything focuses on what the UK wants. And naturally, this has been a debate mainly focused in the UK about what's happening in the UK, about what identity the UK wants to see for itself, about political tensions within the UK that led to Brexit and so forth. But when it comes to actually deciding what actually happens next, Brexit isn't really about Britain. Brexit is actually going to be more about the rest of the European Union, what the rest of the EU want to do. Because as anybody's girlfriend, boyfriend will remind the other one at some point, a relationship is not all about you. It's a two-way thing. Therefore, what is the rest of the EU going to think? And therefore, EU in brackets UK. How are the rest of the 27 governments of the European Union facing their domestic political structures and their elections and so forth, and the tensions within them? What's the European Parliament, the European Commission, the European Court of Justice, and possibly, let's not forget, the other members of the European Economic Area like Norway and Switzerland? What do they think about this, and what deal are they going to start doing amongst themselves in terms of what to offer the UK? That's not going to be an easy thing for the UK to try and sort out, partly because it's going to be locked outside the negotiating chambers when the 27 members negotiate Brexit or discuss Brexit amongst themselves. That's going to leave the UK at a bit of a disadvantage and therefore waiting on the rest of the European Union to come up with something. So far, the rest of the EU has presented a very united front. It has said to Britain, we are not negotiating Brexit until you trigger Article 50. Yes, there will be some quiet discussions in Brussels and between Berlin and London and so forth about what may happen, but in terms of any formal negotiations, the rest of the European Union has been very blunt. No, we're not discussing it until you're prepared to actually trigger Article 50 and come to us and tell us what you exactly want. We're not going to respond until you do. Part of that is a good negotiating tactic. Part of it is also a reflection of the worries within the rest of the European Union that Britain is going to try and divide and rule when it comes to negotiating a new good deal. So it's going to try and play members off against each other in terms of trying to get that deal. In fact, it's also important not to overlook that different member states within the European Union and the European institutions are already manoeuvring themselves to try and take advantage of Brexit, which is something I'll come on to in a moment. They don't want to be left out of this deal, partly because the future of the European Union is going to be shaped by it. Into this, we also need to factor that depending on what is agreed in terms of a new relationship, if the new relationship resembles something like TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or CETA, the Canadian-European Trade Agreement, then there is a very good chance it will have to go through each member state in terms of their individual ratification processes. So, as the Belgian Deputy Prime Minister told me a few weeks ago at an event, there's a very good chance they may have to consult all 7 of Belgium's parliaments, in terms of the regional parliaments and the national parliament and so forth. And as CETA found when it came to Wallonia, it could just take one vote, one region, one little area, one referendum somewhere along the way to kind of throw this into chaos. CETA has eventually got through and been ratified, but will Brexit find it any easier, given that TTIP is running into trouble as well in different member states and possibly dying from 1,000 cuts? Would Brexit go the same way? Then finally, you've got the UK-EU relationship when it comes to foreign security and defence. Now, here you have to go back to something I talked about last week in terms of what the UK is seen as doing in a positive, constructive way in terms of being the quiet European. The one area that the EU knows the UK has something of merit and something to give, something of worth that it wants, is cooperation in foreign security and defence. And that's not just in terms of what the British Army or the Royal Navy or the Royal Air Force can put on the table. It's also in terms of Britain's soft power, its diplomatic power around the world, its ability to help and play a role, say for example in negotiations over the Iran deal, relations with Russia and so forth. Britain therefore is going to have something to say in this, and Britain itself will want to have something to say, as I'll come on to later. Britain's main reference point when it comes to foreign affairs, security, defence and so forth has always been and will remain for the foreseeable future European geopolitics. So the two will want to try and cooperate. But the negotiation here will be about how to continue that cooperation in a way that doesn't undermine NATO for the United Kingdom or NATO for other EU member states, doesn't compromise the European Union's own ability to try and develop itself as a foreign policy, security and defence actor, but does secure some form of relationship where the two can trust each other on matters of high politics. That's going to be a real crunch, and it's not clear how that's going to go, but I'll come back to that a little later. Then we've got what Brexit is going to do to the rest of the European Union. Now, I touched on this briefly in terms of the rest of the EU negotiating amongst themselves about what to offer the UK. Well, if you take the UK out of this, you've got the remaining European Union. What happens to the rest of the EU? Well, first, you'll have a rebalancing within the European Union. You've lost one of the largest, most powerful member states. That inevitably leads to a rebalancing of power within the Union, and there are lots of different scenarios you can go down here in terms of how it redistributes power between the member states, for example, or between the institutions and the different centres of power. So some worry that it will strengthen the Eurozone, and the non-Eurozone members are now going to feel more excluded from the European Union. Some feel it will actually add to European integration and push forward the United States of Europe and so forth. Some fear it will actually disintegrate the European Union, and I'll come back to this later on. Some within the European Union worry that losing the UK and its outward-looking, more liberal economic agenda means that the EU is going to, or the remaining EU is going to become more protectionist, more inward-looking and so forth. Smaller member states fear that this may actually enhance German and French power, that the Franco-German relationship could be strengthened by this and small member states will be sidelined. Big member states worry that actually having lost a big member state, some of the smaller member states may gain from this. You can look at it in terms of the Franco-German relationship. It can be overplayed sometimes, but Britain has often kind of balanced the two. So Germany has often balanced itself against balanced France by aligning itself with Britain, and France has balanced Germany by aligning itself with Britain. Did that make sense? Sorry. France has often balanced itself against Germany by aligning with Britain. Germany has balanced itself against France by aligning with Britain. So you can see if you take this out, where does this leave the Franco-German relationship going forward? Which country is now going to become the awkward partner? My money is actually on France becoming the awkward one again, as it once was. Then you have the question about where this leaves the European Union in Europe, in terms of European geopolitics. You kind of got EU in a multipolar Europe. If things continue as they are in terms of population projections, although these are a bit out of date now, by the middle of the century, you could find that the European Union is surrounded by 3 countries which have larger populations than any member of the European Union. So you've got Russia, Turkey, and the United Kingdom, each of which will dwarf, or at least kind of be much bigger than even Germany or France's population. So what is going to be the position of the European Union within Europe, especially if it remains a very weak, confederal, divided union? Is this something that's going to be torn apart by different powers around the world, especially when it comes to the European Union's position in the world? Having lost a large member state like the UK, what does this send as a signal to countries like Russia or China and others? Does this weaken the European Union's position in the world, or does losing the UK, it hurts, but it's not going to cripple the European Union as some think it might? It's a bit like, if the UK lost Scotland, well, England is still, 56, 57 million people. It's not the end of England as a major power, just like losing the UK is not the end of the European Union as a major power. And then finally, for the European Union, it faces the problem of business as usual. While the United Kingdom is negotiating its withdrawal from the European Union, say under Article 50, it officially remains a member of the European Union entitled to all the same privileges and rights that any other EU member state has, with the one exception that it can't sit in on the meetings where the rest of the EU discuss how they're going to deal with Britain leaving. Some ministers in the United Kingdom, especially during the referendum campaign, said that if we don't get what we want, we could always disrupt EU business as a way of leveraging our position within the European Union. That may not necessarily go down very well within the rest of the European Union, but they have potentially that power to some extent, and the rest of the EU will therefore have to try and go round Britain. But at the same time, the EU is having to negotiate things about its budget for the future, what's going to happen to certain policy areas. Will British MEPs be denied from voting on certain things? No, they probably won't. They have to be given the right and so forth, but therefore, they're still voting on things. So what if they swing the vote on something that Britain won't actually have to implement? Then, finally, global views and security. So here's Donald Trump, and we've heard lots of talk in the last few days and months leading up to the election result today about whether Brexit was a harbinger of, or kind of a weather vane of Western politics and a sign of where US and maybe even French and German politics are going to be going in the longer run. So what would Brexit, or what does Brexit mean for kind of global issues and security? Well, first of all, we'll start with the United Kingdom. Again, these are kind of familiar issues which I've touched on. First of all, you've got the issue of the geopolitics of the British Isles, potentially Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. As I said, don't bank on that, but it's a very real danger, nevertheless. That then triggers a real crisis for Britain in terms of its nuclear deterrent, which is based in Scotland, and it is very difficult to move. Moving Trident out of Scotland, out of Faslane and Coalport, where they keep the warheads, is exceptionally difficult. There's nowhere in England that anybody can see to put them, and certainly not within a short time frame. Questions about Northern Ireland and the stability of the Northern Ireland peace process come up into this, and finally the unity of the United Kingdom. If the number one aim of any country in terms of national security is maintaining its unity, then Brexit could pose the biggest threat to the unity of the United Kingdom since the 1916 Easter uprising in Ireland that eventually led to Irish independence. So this isn't a minor event. This could actually really reshape the United Kingdom as a political entity. So as I said, nuclear weapons come into this. Maybe Trident may have to be scrapped or something quite radical done. The economics in terms of paying for defence, well, there's already been a cost in terms of the pound's drop in value against the dollar and so forth, so it's become more expensive for the UK government to buy certain defence equipment. In the longer run, some projections are already saying, well, okay, in the longer run, the British economy may be 4, 6, 7, whatever, pick your percentage, smaller in the longer run over 20 years. That might not sound much, but when you step back and look at it over a 50-year period, you realise that's four warships ordered rather than 6. That's 2 regiments amalgamated rather than just 1. Over the long run, you can see the chipping away maybe Britain's defence capabilities because of what it can afford. Britain, at the moment, manages to spend 2% of its GDP on defence in line with NATO guidelines, one of the few countries in the European Union or in NATO that does. Nevertheless, that's been hard to do. It's taken some dodgy accounting, and the British Ministry of Defence and the defence sector, until a few years ago, was in an absolute mess that it's only just managed to crawl out of the hole of. So again, the cost for defence could emerge over the long term, but in the short term, it's not going to hit it unless something big happens. And then finally, UK attention. It should become clear to you by now that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and most senior members of Her Majesty's government are going to spend most of their time dealing with Brexit for the foreseeable future. It is going to be the issue that defines Theresa May's premiership, at least for the next 5 years, possibly even longer. It's going to consume the Foreign Office. There's already been turf wars within Whitehall, within British government, between the Foreign Office and the 2 new departments that were set up to deal with Brexit, the Department for International Trade and the Department for Exiting the EU. They've been fighting over the limited resources that British government has in terms of its diplomats, trade negotiators, office space and so forth. And for the last few years, the British Foreign Office has been told, stop paying attention to Europe, go off and deal with Africa, South America, Asia and so forth. Europe is not really foreign policy, so you shouldn't be thinking about that. And they have. They've cut their representation elsewhere in the European Union. Unfortunately now, they're going to have to reverse that because Britain is no longer going to be in the decision-making rooms when it comes to being a member of the European Union. Instead, it's going to be outside, so it's going to have to be a decision shaper, and the European Union is still going to matter a lot to the United Kingdom. So the Foreign Office is going to have to expect a lot more of the reduced Foreign Office representation across the rest of the European Union. Then in terms of what it means for the EU, well, the European Union does have some military ambitions. It has run a small number of military operations. Yes, they're very limited. The EU remains something of a military worm. It's an economic giant when it comes to trade wars. It certainly is a superpower. It's a political, it has a political power around the world, but when it comes to military power, it's a worm, as it was once described. Nevertheless, it's tried to do things, and the UK has contributed to those military operations. So has the United States. But the United States has only contributed civilians, not military staff, so can the EU really genuinely push forward with defence cooperation if the UK has left the European Union? There was a summit in Bratislava a few weeks ago in which the rest of the EU discussed what it was going to do now that Britain was leaving. And what did the summit conclusions reveal? Well, they wanted to focus on defence and security cooperation. And for some people, this is just absurd. The last thing you should be doing right now is pushing for integration in one of the most sensitive areas, and in an area where you really can't get it together within the European Union, in NATO, let alone on your own, and the UK is leaving, so you're just trying to counter that by pursuing something that's unrealistic. Nevertheless, there are ambitions for the European Union to do more in this area, but can they do it without the United Kingdom, given the UK's contributions in this area have often been important, but also important in holding them back. There's the issue of security and policing and counter-terrorism work. Of course, cooperation here will continue. It makes common sense to carry on, but there are already enough sensitive issues relating to transatlantic sharing of data and kind of things like passenger records that could easily blow up as an issue between the United Kingdom and the rest of the European Union in terms of what we are and are not prepared to share. So the UK could find itself in something of a second-tier partner, limited because of institutional constraints and legal constraints, both by the UK and also by the remaining EU members in terms of what they can and cannot share and cooperate, and the diplomatic kind of difficulties they face in trying to find a way around this. What does it mean for NATO-EU relations? Again, it depends on where the European Union goes in terms of its defence capabilities. The UK will certainly put a lot more emphasis now on NATO as an arena in which it expects to see high political issues of European security, geopolitics, international relations, whatever you want to call it, discussed. But that runs into the reality of, into the uncomfortable reality that when it comes to most non-traditional security matters, such as the environment, such as, say, crime and so forth, it tends to be the EU that's now the predominant actor within Europe. Traditional defence, NATO, definitely NATO. But in other areas, say environmental security, for example, it's going to be the European Union that will lead on these things. So the UK is going to have to find a way of trying to balance these two. And there are some, unfortunately, in the UK who have already voiced the opinion that Britain could threaten to throw its NATO toys out of the pram in terms of trying to leverage a deal with countries in Eastern Europe. So if the countries in Eastern Europe don't play ball in terms of agreeing to what Britain wants as an exit agreement, then Britain could say, fine, we're going to possibly pull our commitment to you when it comes to NATO. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think Britain should put NATO on the table. It is on the table in terms of something that Britain contributes, but actually putting it clearly on the table as a negotiating tactic is probably a bit silly. Nevertheless, you can see that may come up as a debating point. There's the issue that Britain will forget Europe again in terms of security and defence. That it will try to it will try and pivot away from Europe. It will try to pivot away and look to Asia, look to Africa, look to the Americas and so forth. But as anybody who has followed Obama's pivot away from Europe will know, the more time he has spent in office, and we're getting close to the end of his time in office now, the more time he seems to spend talking to Europeans, because yes, you can pivot to Asia and so forth, but when it comes down to it, who is the United States' main kind of confidants and trusted allies in the world? They tend to be European countries. And the UK is still going to find itself in that position. The UK can't pivot from Europe like the United States can to Asia. So therefore, what's it going to do? How's it going to build a relationship with this organisation or with a European continent where it's opted out of the predominant organisation for politics, economics and non-traditional security? How is it going to relate to this? Is it going to turn its back on this? In which case, it's forgetting that its main reference point for security, for defence, is always what happens in a European context. It's not what happens in the South China Sea. It's not what happens in Africa. It's first and primarily what happens within Europe. US-UK relations, well, we'll find out today whether Britain finds itself between a Trump rock and a Brexit hard place. If Donald Trump were to become president of the United States, that will cause some significant difficulties for the United Kingdom in terms of trust and confidence in the special relationship with the United States. But then who's it going to turn to? Britain is stuck within this transatlantic relationship where it's turned its back on the European Union and could be finding the United States is not exactly a great friend either. And then emerging powers. How does Russia view this? At a conference a few weeks ago where someone was talking about Russian views of Europe and the Crimea, the author was pointing out that Russia takes a very geopolitical view of international relations, and it's only natural you take a geopolitical view when your country is so big, with so many borders with different countries all around the world. Therefore, it takes a very geopolitical view, and as he pointed out, from a Russian perspective, the European Union has just lost a large chunk of territory, and it seems to have done so without much of a fight or putting up much of a struggle. It's lost it in a way that weakens it economically, militarily, in terms of its soft power, causes divisions and so forth. Well, from a Russian perspective, therefore, Brexit could be seen as a sign of European disintegration, weakness, and therefore decline, and something that Russia may take advantage of. Others dispute that. Actually, some say more chaos in Europe, economically, politically, and so forth, does not benefit Russia at the moment, given that it's feeling the economic pain from sanctions organised by the rest of the European Union, including the UK. How does China view this? Well, again, it depends. China's struggled to try and understand the European Union over the decades, and maybe it may understand the UK leaving in terms of actual bilateral relations, but the Chinese government has kind of always said that it prefers to see a UK within the European Union, partly because maybe the European Union is one of those counterbalances to the United States in terms of emerging, from the perspective of emerging power. And it would rather see that stay together than fall apart. So finally, how to study Brexit. Well, not finally, actually. Nearly finally. There are different ways to studying Brexit. As I pointed out, there were different debates within the UK, there were different debates in the European Union, there were different processes, there were different possible outcomes. You can pick 101 different outcomes. If you write to choose your own Brexit adventure, one of the biggest problems is trying to work out all the different endings that you could end up in. So how are you going to break this down? How are you going to open this up in terms of analysing it in a more structured way? Well, there's one way which you could do it, which is to use kind of theories. Now, most students and most listeners to this this lecture will probably shudder at the mention of the word theory and think of theory as all this airy-fairy stuff. Who cares about that? But let's just remember, theories are basically a tool which you can use as like a light, a torch. You pick up your realist torch or your constructivist torch, and you shine your constructivist torch on Brexit, and it highlights what, from constructivist views, are the most important things within the Brexit process or Brexit in general that you need to focus on to try and understand what is happening, what has happened, and what's going to happen in future. So you could use, just to break it down into 4 basic approaches, you could use constructivism, where you look at the ideas behind Brexit, or that are going to clash in this. This is going to be about clash of ideas, essentially. On the one side, you have a clash. On the one side, you have British ideas of sovereignty, of great power status, and so forth. On the other side, you have European ideas of ever closer union, of European integration, and so forth. Because, as Eurosceptics always point out, quite rightly, the European Union is a political project. So a constructivist will say, well, there you go. It's the political ideas that are going to define how the European Union responds to this. So you're going to see a clash of ideas here between British sovereignty and great power and European ideas of unity. So the European Union can't allow Britain to get a good deal that endangers those ideas of its own integration. Realists, on the other hand, will say, no, it's all going to be about interests. Those interests could be military interests, they could be economic interests. From Britain's perspective, it will do a deal with the rest of the European Union because it's in its realist interest in terms of its economic connections with the European Union are too big, it's going to be too costly, so it makes sense for Britain to do an economic deal. Same within the rest of the European Union. The German car manufacturers are going to be so concerned about the possible impact upon German car manufacturing links with the United Kingdom that they will push for Germany to realise there's too much at stake here in terms of our economic interests, we will do a deal. One of the problems here is, are we going to talk about EU member states, different interests, or an EU interest in itself? And in the UK, you could argue there are different interests there. Are there interests within Scotland, London, Northern Ireland, and so forth? You could use a kind of a bureaucratic politics approach, a kind of institutional approach of opening up the institutions and say, actually, it's the procedures. It's going to be things like Article 50 that are going to be the most important ways of understanding how Brexit unfolds and what actually happens. Understanding the bureaucratic politics between the different institutions, in Brussels especially. Don't overlook that, for example, the European Parliament and the European Commission are very determined that they will have their voice heard over Brexit, not because they care primarily about relations between the EU and the UK, it's just that they don't want to be pushed to one side within the EU institutional setup in terms of the member states saying, we're going to do a deal with Britain, and the European Parliament and the European Commission and the European Court of Justice, they can just do what they're told. They're not going to allow that to happen. Or you could use a cognitivist approach, which is to get inside the minds of the individuals who will be involved. What exactly do you think Angela Merkel is going to say about Brexit? What is her individual position on this? What does Theresa May think about this? What will the next French president, whoever he or she is, think about Brexit? So you could get down to the individual level and say, actually, it's going to be about these individuals trying to do a deal around a dinner table, probably late at night. Might even throw in a bit of sleep deprivation here along the way. What is it that these actual individual leaders believe in? Is that going to be what actually determines Brexit? And then finally, there's the issue of European disintegration. Is Brexit going to disintegrate the European Union or unify it? Because the EU doesn't exactly look like it's in a great state at the moment. A friend of mine at the Centre for European Reform, Rem Cordoveg, wrote a little while ago that Europe seems to be surrounded by the four horsemen of the apocalypse. You have war going about his business in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. You have death harvesting refugees and economic migrants in the Mediterranean. You have famine of sort going about his business in places like Greece through economic hardship and so forth. And you have pestilence, which is Britain with Euroscepticism, spreading Euroscepticism and disunity around the European Union. And so when you look at it from that perspective, the European Union doesn't look in a great shape. And that's certainly the perspective from the rest of the EU. If you go back to those negotiations, say back here in terms of the actual EU's negotiations, the one thing they're all going to be thinking about is not necessarily the UK and what's good for the UK or what's even good for UK-EU relations. The primary concern of the EU will be its unity and protecting that. But at the moment, Brexit is only one of those threats. You've got Schengen, you've got problems with Russia, you've got problems in terms of Euroscepticism spreading around the European Union. If you look at some opinion polling, the UK isn't actually that extreme when it comes to views of migrants. Some countries in Eastern Europe are far more hostile to migrants and haven't even still come to terms with people like the Roma. But let's focus on Brexit for the moment. Is Brexit going to lead to European disintegration? Well, there are different ways in which you can study European disintegration. Although, that said, European disintegration tends to be a very, very limited topic. There's only a few articles out there that try and understand Brexit, try and understand European disintegration. Most theories of the European Union have been about the EU moving forward, about why it's integrated or how it's integrated, never about how it goes backwards and falls apart. One way you can do this, and this was done by Douglas Weber in an article, How Likely Is It That the EU Will Disintegrate, is to take your classical theories of European integration and essentially ask what would it take to throw them back into reverse. Some dispute this and say actually European disintegration is not integration in reverse, you've got to look at other factors, and I'll come on to an important one in a moment, but you can go through different theoretical outlooks to see what it would take to actually bring about European disintegration. So a realist approach, if you took John Mearsheimer's approach, say that actually the European Union is held together essentially by an American security guarantee that's never been tested in terms of if the Americans ever went home, then the European Union would fall apart because each member state would start disagreeing about how to defend themselves. Well, will Brexit create that? Not on its own, unless, of course, it adds to tensions that do drive the United States to leave Europe and so forth. But, okay, that's one plausible approach. Classic intergovernmentalism, well, usually that's about the kind of the interests of all three, especially Britain, France, and Germany, but especially France and Germany. Their views of European integration are aligning and therefore pushing it forward. If Brexit would have caused tensions in the Franco-German relationship, then maybe that brings about a real disintegrating pressure. You can move down to ideas like, down here, Andy Moravcik, down at Princeton. His idea that if you threw Brexit into reverse here, actually there won't be any disintegration because from a liberal intergovernmentalist perspective, the European Union is a bit like the Hotel California. You can check out any time you like, but you can never really leave. But because of economic interdependence and so forth, actually Britain can't leave the European Union, and therefore disintegration of the European Union isn't really imaginable. And besides, if you take the word disintegration, what does that actually mean? Does it mean that we go back to some setup where you have individual sovereign nation states around Europe, but then what happens in terms of their relationships through NATO, through the OSCE? What does this mean for the Eurozone? Would maybe we see a reduction of the EU in terms of the collapse of some countries leaving it, but you'd see a focus on a certain core EU around a remnant of the Eurozone, so you would see a reconfiguration of the EU. So disintegration itself is not a very clear term. Is Brexit going to cause this? Well, arguably not, unless you take into account one country. The one thing that Douglas Weber in his article argues is that the European Union has never faced a crisis made in Germany. In other words, Germany has never lost faith so dramatically in the European Union that it's prepared to give up on this. Germany is, of course, the economic heart, the geographical heart, the political heart, the paymaster. People look to Angela Merkel and the German leadership to run Europe. Germany can be described as the hegemon in a European context. So if the Germans were to give up on this, then we're into uncharted territory. Then we could start talking about European disintegration. But again, a lot depends on how Germany would want that disintegration to go forward. And so far, Brexit has not yet caused a crisis made in Germany. But again, what happens if Brexit, which you should be aware by now, is a long drawn-out process, could be 2, 5, maybe more years in length. What happens if Brexit aligns with another crisis in Schengen or the Eurozone? Does that basically put too much pressure on the political structure of the European Union? People like Angela Merkel decide, you know what, let's start with something new. Let's kind of reconfigure all this. I don't think it's going to happen, but nevertheless, that's one plausible way in which you may see Brexit add to pressures that bring about major change to the European Union. So finally, where does this leave the United Kingdom? On the right, you have the front cover of The Economist. I think that was the front cover just in the run-up to the referendum, but then on the left you have the campaign literature from ereferendum.com. Okay, so some kind of Eurosceptic kind of websites. So do you want to see a global Britain leaving a little Europe, or do you want to see a Great Britain in Europe and a little England? Little England being a term that's used as a kind of a pejorative term for people who want to see Britain isolate itself from the world in some respects. Where is Brexit going to take Britain in terms of these choices? Well, I think the one thing that we don't appreciate in Britain well enough, partly because the debate has been focused entirely on Britain and British politics, is that Brexit, as I've made clear, is not really going to be defined by what happens to the United Kingdom. Yes, a lot depends upon what type of country Britain wants to be, in terms of the reforms it can take forward, in terms of its productivity, in terms of its unity and so forth, which will certainly be defined by political debates within the United Kingdom. But a lot will hang upon what happens to the rest of the European Union. What happens today in the US presidential election if, let's imagine, Donald Trump were to win. What does that mean for Britain in terms of the kind of the global Britain that it wants to pursue? Well, Brexit could have been a kind of a weather vane of a more closed, isolated international trading system, one which a global Britain is not going to find itself very well positioned to deal with, because Britain is a very open global economy. Might not necessarily sit with a large number of people who voted for Brexit, but nevertheless that's the British government's approach. But that depends upon the rest of Europe, the United States and the rest of the world being committed to that type of global open economy. That is what will probably determine whether or not Brexit will be a success. Thank you very much.